The wind howled through the canyon as Maria Martinez stood before the towering figure of Tyler Cox, her calloused hands trembling as she extended them toward him. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Any work for a meal, sir. I'll do anything." The mountain man's weathered face softened as his eyes fell upon her rough, work-worn hands, and in that moment, something shifted in his chest. He had seen those hands before, not on her, but on his own mother years ago when she had begged for the same mercy from strangers who had turned her away. Without a word, Tyler reached into his coat and pulled out not just coins, but his own worn leather gloves, pressing them gently into her palms along with enough money to last her weeks. "You don't need to work for anything," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Some things in this world should be given freely." But how had Maria Martinez come to stand before this mysterious mountain man in the depths of winter, her pride stripped away and her hands bearing the evidence of desperate survival? The story began 3 months earlier, when the first frost had settled over the mining town of Copper Ridge, and Maria's world had begun to crumble like autumn leaves beneath an unforgiving sky. Maria had once been the wife of a prosperous merchant, living in a modest but comfortable home on the edge of Copper Ridge. Her husband Roberto had built a small but thriving business trading supplies with the miners who worked the treacherous mountain claims. They had been happy, or so Maria had believed, until the morning she woke to find Roberto gone, along with every cent they had saved and most of their valuable possessions. The note he left behind was brief and cruel, explaining that he had found someone younger and prettier in the next town over, and that Maria should consider herself fortunate he hadn't sold the house out from under her before leaving. The shock of abandonment hit Maria like a physical blow, leaving her gasping and disoriented in the empty rooms that had once felt like home. For days she wandered through the house in a daze, touching familiar objects and trying to make sense of how her life had collapsed so completely in a single night. The neighbors whispered behind their curtains, some with pity, others with barely concealed satisfaction at seeing the formerly respectable Maria Martinez brought low by scandal and desertion. As the weeks passed, the harsh reality of her situation became impossible to ignore. The small amount of money Roberto had left behind dwindled quickly as Maria struggled to pay for food and fuel. She had never worked outside her home, had never needed to develop the skills that might have helped her survive independently. Her soft hands, once her pride as they arranged flowers and prepared elaborate meals for Roberto's business associates, now seemed like a mockery of her helplessness. The first job Maria found was cleaning houses for the wealthier families in town, scrubbing floors and washing laundry for women who had once invited her to their tea parties. The work was backbreaking and humiliating, made worse by the pitying glances and whispered comments of her former friends. Her hands, unused to such harsh labor, quickly became raw and cracked from the lye soap and constant scrubbing. Blisters formed and burst, leaving painful sores that made every task an agony. But Maria persevered because she had no choice. When the cleaning work dried up as winter approached and the wealthy families retreated to warmer climates, Maria found herself taking increasingly desperate measures to survive. She sold her wedding ring, her few remaining pieces of jewelry, and finally her furniture, piece by piece, until she was sleeping on a bare mattress in an empty house. The cold seeped through the walls like a living thing, and Maria would lie awake at night, listening to the wind and wondering how much longer she could hold on. It was during this darkest period that Maria first heard stories of Tyler Cox, the mysterious mountain man who lived somewhere in the high peaks above Copper Ridge. The townspeople spoke of him in hushed tones, describing a giant of a man who appeared without warning to help stranded travelers or rescue miners trapped by avalanches. Some said he was a former soldier who had retreated to the mountains after seeing too much death and violence. Others claimed he was running from a tragic past, hiding from memories too painful to bear. What everyone agreed on was that Tyler Cox was dangerous to cross, but generous to those in genuine need. Maria had always dismissed these stories as frontier folklore, the kind of tall tales that grew with each telling around saloon fires. But as her desperation deepened and her options dwindled, she found herself thinking more and more about the legendary mountain man. If even half the stories were true, Tyler Cox might be her last hope for survival as winter tightened its grip on the high country. The decision to seek out Tyler Cox came on a particularly bitter morning when Maria woke to find ice crystals forming on the inside of her windows. She had not eaten in 2 days, and her body was beginning to betray her with weakness and dizzy spells. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt like a tomb, and Maria realized that if she did not act soon, it might actually become one. She dressed in her warmest clothes, layering everything she owned in preparation for the journey into the mountains. Her hands, now permanently roughened and scarred from months of hard labor, shook as she laced up her worn boots. The mirror in her bedroom showed a woman she barely recognized, gaunt and hollow-eyed, aged years in the span of months. But there was still fight left in her, still a spark of the determination that had carried her through Roberto's abandonment and the subsequent months of struggle. The path up into the mountains was treacherous, made worse by the fresh snow that had fallen during the night. Maria slipped and stumbled repeatedly, her inadequate footwear providing little traction on the icy rocks. Her breath came in ragged gasps in the thin air, and more than once she considered turning back. But each time doubt crept in, she thought of the empty house below and the certainty of slow starvation that awaited her there. As she climbed higher, the stories she had heard about Tyler Cox took on new significance. The mountains seemed vast and hostile, full of hidden dangers and unmarked trails that could lead an inexperienced traveler to disaster. How did one find a man who clearly did not wish to be found? How could she locate someone who knew these peaks like his own heartbeat, while she could barely navigate the familiar streets of Copper Ridge? The answer came in the form of smoke, a thin gray line rising from somewhere deeper in the forest. Maria followed it like a beacon, pushing through snow-laden branches and across frozen streams, driven by a hope so fragile she dared not examine it too closely. The smoke led her to a clearing where a small cabin sat nestled against a wall of granite, its chimney sending up the welcoming signal that had drawn her through the wilderness. For a long moment, Maria stood at the edge of the clearing, gathering her courage and trying to find the words that might convince a stranger to help her. The cabin looked sturdy and well-maintained, with neat stacks of firewood and tools arranged with military precision. Whoever lived here was clearly self-sufficient and organized, qualities that Maria envied desperately in her current state of chaos and need. When Tyler Cox emerged from the cabin, Maria's first impression was of sheer size and presence. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed broad enough to carry the weight of the mountains themselves. His dark hair was longer than fashionable, and his beard showed streaks of premature gray that spoke of hard living and difficult experiences. But it was his eyes that caught Maria's attention, dark and watchful, holding depths of understanding that suggested he had seen his share of suffering. For a moment they simply looked at each other across the clearing, two souls isolated by circumstance and choice, each taking the measure of the other. Tyler's expression was unreadable, but Maria thought she detected a flicker of recognition in his gaze, as if he understood immediately why she had come to his remote sanctuary. "You're a long way from town," Tyler said finally, his voice carrying easily across the space between them. There was no hostility in his tone, but no particular warmth either. Just the neutral observation of a man accustomed to solitude. "I am," Maria replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded, despite the trembling in her limbs. "I've come to ask for work if you have any. I'm not proud, sir. I'll do whatever needs doing for a meal and perhaps shelter from the storm." Tyler's eyes moved over her systematically, taking in her inadequate clothing, her worn boots, the way she swayed slightly on her feet from exhaustion and hunger. When his gaze fell to her hands, Maria saw something change in his expression, a softening that transformed his austere features into something approaching gentleness. "Show me your hands," he said quietly, stepping closer. Maria hesitated, knowing that her hands told the story of her fall from respectability more clearly than any words could. The calluses, the scars, the permanent staining from harsh chemicals and rough work, all of it marked her as someone who had been brought low by circumstances beyond her control. But there was something in Tyler's voice that brooked no argument, so she extended her hands, palms up, for his inspection. Tyler studied her hands for a long moment, his own large fingers surprisingly gentle as he turned them this way and that, examining the evidence of her struggles. Maria watched his face, trying to read the thoughts behind those dark eyes, wondering if he would turn her away as so many others had done. These hands have seen honest work, Tyler said finally, his voice carrying a note of respect that Maria had not heard in months. Hard work, the kind that breaks you down before it builds you back up. You didn't come by these calluses easily. No, sir, Maria replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't. Tyler nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. What's your name? Maria Martinez. I used to live in Copper Ridge before my husband left and took everything with him. And now you're here, asking a stranger for work because you've got nowhere else to turn. It wasn't a question, but Maria nodded anyway, feeling tears threaten at the simple acknowledgement of her desperation. She had grown so accustomed to hiding her circumstances, to maintaining whatever dignity she could salvage, that Tyler's direct recognition of her plight was both relief and agony. Tyler was quiet for several minutes, his gaze moving between Maria's face and her work-worn hands. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of personal experience and hard-won wisdom. I knew a woman once who had hands like yours, he said, his voice taking on a distant quality. My mother. She worked herself to the bone trying to keep food on our table after my father died in a mining accident. I watched her hands change from soft and smooth to scarred and calloused. Watched her beg for work from people who had once treated her with respect. Some gave her jobs, others turned her away. But she never stopped trying, never stopped fighting to keep us alive. Maria felt her heart constrict at the pain in Tyler's voice, recognizing the echo of her own struggles in his childhood memories. What happened to her? She asked softly. She died the winter I turned 16, worn out from years of hard labor and worry. I swore then that if I ever had the chance, I'd help women like her, women who found themselves alone and desperate through no fault of their own. The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding and unspoken grief. Maria realized that Tyler Cox was not just a mountain hermit or a legendary figure from frontier stories, but a man shaped by loss and hardship, someone who understood the weight of desperation because he had carried it himself. I don't have much work that needs doing, Tyler said finally, breaking the spell of memory that had settled over them both. But I've got food and shelter, and winter's coming on hard. You can stay until the snow melts, help with whatever needs doing around the place, and I'll make sure you don't go hungry or cold. Maria stared at him in disbelief, hardly daring to believe that her desperate gamble had paid off. I can work hard, she said quickly, afraid he might change his mind. I'm stronger than I look, and I learn quickly. I won't be a burden, I promise. Tyler's expression softened further, and for the first time since she had arrived, Maria saw him smile. It transformed his entire face, revealing the kind and generous man hidden beneath the stern exterior. You're not a burden, he said firmly. You're a person in need, and that's reason enough to help. Come on, let's get you inside before you freeze to death in my clearing. That wouldn't do much for my reputation as a rescuer of stranded travelers. The cabin's interior was a revelation, far more comfortable and well-appointed than Maria had expected. The main room centered around a massive stone fireplace that radiated blessed warmth, while shelves lined the walls filled with books, tools, and various supplies. Everything was clean and organized, speaking to Tyler's methodical nature and the discipline that had allowed him to thrive in this isolated environment. Tyler guided Maria to a chair near the fire and began preparing food without being asked, moving around the kitchen area with practiced efficiency. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, making Maria's empty stomach clench with desperate hunger. She watched him work, marveling at the care he took with even simple tasks, the way he moved with quiet confidence through his domain. How long have you lived up here? Maria asked, partly from curiosity and partly to fill the comfortable silence that had settled between them. About 8 years now, Tyler replied, not looking up from the stove. Came up here after the war, needed some time to think and heal. Planned to stay maybe a year, but the mountains have a way of holding on to you once they get their hooks in. Don't you get lonely? Tyler paused in his cooking, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Sometimes, he admitted, but loneliness is better than being surrounded by people who don't understand what you've been through. Up here, I can be myself without having to explain or justify anything to anyone. Maria understood that feeling more than she cared to admit. The months since Roberto's abandonment had been filled with well-meaning but ultimately hollow sympathy from people who could not truly comprehend the depth of her fall from grace. The constant need to maintain appearances, to pretend that she was managing better than she actually was, had been almost as exhausting as the physical labor itself. When Tyler placed a plate of food in front of her, Maria had to force herself not to fall on it like a starving animal. The bacon was perfectly cooked, the eggs fresh and rich, the bread homemade and still warm from the oven. It was the best meal she had eaten in months, not just because of her hunger, but because it was prepared and offered with genuine kindness. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't remember the last time someone showed me such kindness without expecting anything in return." Tyler settled into the chair across from her with his own plate, studying her face in the firelight. "What did your husband do before he left?" "He was a merchant, traded supplies with the miners. We had a good life, or I thought we did. I never suspected that he was planning to leave. Never saw any signs that he was unhappy or looking elsewhere." "Some men are good at hiding their true nature," Tyler observed quietly. "They put on a show for the world while their hearts are somewhere else entirely. It's not your fault that you trusted him." The simple absolution in Tyler's words hit Maria harder than any elaborate sympathy could have. For months she had tortured herself with questions about what she might have done differently, how she might have prevented Roberto's abandonment. To hear someone say definitively that it was not her fault felt like a weight being lifted from her shoulders. "I keep thinking I should have known," she confessed. "Should have seen the signs. Should have been more interesting or attractive. Or whatever it was he found lacking in me. A man who abandons his wife without warning or explanation is showing you his character. Not yours," Tyler said firmly. "You're better off without him, even if it doesn't feel that way right now." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the warmth of the fire and the food gradually restoring some of Maria's strength. She found herself studying Tyler's face when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to reconcile the gentle man sharing his meal with her with the legendary figure she had heard described in town. There was clearly more to Tyler Cox than the story suggested, depths of kindness and understanding that the frontier tales had missed entirely. "What will you do when spring comes?" Tyler asked eventually, his tone carefully neutral. Maria set down her fork, the question hitting her like a cold wind. She had been so focused on surviving the immediate crisis that she had not allowed herself to think beyond the winter months. The truth was, she had no idea what she would do when the snow melted, and she could no longer justify staying in Tyler's cabin. "I don't know," she admitted. "I suppose I'll have to go back to Copper Ridge, try to find work again. Maybe things will be different by then." Tyler nodded thoughtfully, but Maria could see that he was not entirely satisfied with her answer. There was something in his expression that suggested he was already forming plans of his own, though he kept them to himself for the moment. As the evening wore on, Tyler showed Maria to a small but comfortable bedroom at the back of the cabin, complete with warm blankets and a window that looked out over the moonlit peaks. It was the first time in months that Maria had felt truly safe and secure, protected not just from the elements, but from the judgment and pity of the outside world. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow sparkling on the peaks like scattered diamonds. Maria woke to the sound of Tyler moving around the main room, already up and preparing for the day's tasks. She dressed quickly and emerged to find him banking the fire and organizing supplies, every movement efficient and purposeful. "Good morning," Tyler said, looking up from his work with a smile that seemed to come more easily than it had the night before. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Maria replied honestly. "What can I do to help?" Tyler gestured toward the kitchen area. "If you're comfortable with cooking, breakfast would be appreciated. I'm not much of a cook myself, tend to keep things simple and functional rather than particularly tasty." Maria moved to the stove with a sense of purpose she had almost forgotten she possessed. Cooking had always been one of her strengths, one of the few domestic skills that had brought her genuine satisfaction during her marriage. As she worked, she found herself humming softly, a habit she had lost during the dark months of struggle and desperation. Tyler watched her work with obvious appreciation, not just for the skill she displayed, but for the transformation in her demeanor. The frightened, desperate woman who had appeared in his clearing the day before was still there, But she was joined now by glimpses of the confident, capable person Maria had been before life knocked her down. "You have a gift for this," Tyler observed as Maria plated eggs that were perfectly cooked and seasoned with herbs she had found in his well-stocked pantry. "I used to love cooking for Roberto and his business associates," Maria said, then paused, surprised that the memory did not bring its usual stab of pain. "I suppose I still love it, even without them to cook for. Then you should keep doing it, for yourself if nothing else. A person needs to hold on to the things that bring them joy, especially when everything else seems uncertain." They settled into a routine over the following days that felt surprisingly natural and comfortable. Tyler would tend to his outdoor tasks, checking trap lines, chopping wood, and maintaining the various systems that allowed him to live self-sufficiently in the mountains. Maria took charge of the domestic sphere, cooking, cleaning, and organizing, with a thoroughness that impressed even Tyler's methodical nature. But more than the practical partnership, they developed an easy companionship that neither had expected. Tyler proved to be an excellent storyteller, regaling Maria with tales of his adventures in the mountains, his encounters with wildlife, and the various travelers he had helped over the years. Maria, in turn, shared memories of her life before Roberto's abandonment, painting pictures of the woman she had been and the dreams she had once harbored. One evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a bottle of wine Tyler had been saving for a special occasion, Maria found herself asking the question that had been nagging at her for days. "Why did you really help me? I mean, I'm grateful beyond words, but you don't know anything about me. I could have been lying about my circumstances, could have been dangerous in some way." Tyler was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as he considered his answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of long-held pain and carefully guarded hope. "I told you about my mother, about watching her struggle and eventually die from the weight of her hardships. What I didn't tell you was that I've spent years looking for a way to make peace with that, to find some meaning in her suffering and my inability to save her." He turned to look at Maria directly, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight and something deeper, more personal. "When I saw you standing in my clearing, saw those hands that told the story of your struggles, I realized that maybe this was my chance. Maybe I couldn't save my mother, but I could help you. Maybe that's enough to balance the scales, at least a little." Maria felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the generosity of spirit that Tyler's words revealed. She had come to his cabin seeking nothing more than survival, but she was discovering something far more precious, genuine human connection based on understanding and mutual respect. "I don't know how to repay you for this kindness," she said softly. "You don't need to repay anything," Tyler replied. "But if you want to do something for me, don't give up on yourself. Don't let what Roberto did define who you are or what you're capable of becoming." As winter deepened around them, Maria began to understand what Tyler meant. Away from the judgment and pity of Copper Ridge, freed from the constant struggle for basic survival, she started to rediscover aspects of herself that had been buried under months of desperation and shame. She was intelligent and resourceful, capable of learning new skills and adapting to challenging circumstances. She was stronger than she had realized, both physically and emotionally, with a resilience that had carried her through the darkest period of her life. Tyler, meanwhile, was experiencing his own transformation. The solitary existence that had once seemed necessary for his peace of mind was revealed to be incomplete without someone to share it with. Maria's presence in the cabin brought warmth and life to spaces that had been merely functional before. Her laughter, her questions, her different perspective on familiar surroundings, all of it combined to make Tyler realize how much he had been missing in his self-imposed isolation. The turning point came during a fierce blizzard that trapped them in the cabin for 3 days straight. The storm was unlike anything Maria had ever experienced, with winds that shook the sturdy log walls and snow that piled up past the windows. Tyler had warned her about the severity of mountain weather, but the reality was far more intense than his descriptions had prepared her for. On the second day of the storm, when the constant howling of the wind and the claustrophobic feeling of being trapped began to wear on both of them, Maria made a confession that surprised them both with its honesty. "I'm scared," she said simply, looking up from the book she had been trying unsuccessfully to read. "Not of the storm exactly, but of what happens when it ends, of going back to the world and trying to figure out how to live in it again. Tyler set aside the piece of leather he had been working on and gave her his full attention. What scares you most about it? Starting over, building a new life from nothing when I'm not even sure who I am anymore. Roberto's leaving didn't just take away my security, it took away my identity. I was his wife, the merchant's wife, and when that ended, I didn't know what was left. What do you think is left? Tyler asked gently. Maria considered the question seriously, looking around the cabin that had become a sanctuary and a place of discovery. I think maybe there's more left than I realized. These past weeks living here with you, I've remembered things about myself that I thought were gone forever. I like taking care of people, making a home comfortable and welcoming. I'm braver than I thought I was, stronger than I gave myself credit for. I can learn new things, adapt to circumstances I never imagined facing. Tyler nodded encouragingly. Those are all valuable qualities, things that will serve you well no matter what you decide to do next. But where do I go with them? How do I build a life around being Maria Martinez instead of Mrs. Roberto Martinez? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Tyler was quiet for a long time, and Maria could see him wrestling with something internal, some decision or realization that he was not yet ready to voice. When the storm finally broke on the third day, it left behind a world transformed by snow and ice, beautiful and alien in its winter perfection. Maria stood at the cabin window looking out at the pristine landscape and felt a strange sense of completion, as if she had passed through some kind of trial and emerged changed on the other side. Tyler joined her at the window, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. They watched the sunrise paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and pink, a sight so beautiful it seemed almost sacred in its perfection. "I have something to tell you," Tyler said finally, his voice carrying a note of nervous determination. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not knowing where to go or how to build a new life." Maria turned to look at him, seeing something in his expression that made her heart beat faster. "I know this might be presumptuous, and I don't want you to feel pressured or obligated in any way, but I'd like you to consider staying here permanently, not as someone seeking charity or temporary shelter, but as my partner, my equal in building a life together." Maria stared at him in shock, hardly able to process what he was saying. "Tyler, I don't understand. We've only known each other for a few weeks." "I know it seems sudden," Tyler said, his words coming faster now, as if he needed to get them all out before he lost his nerve. "But I've learned more about you in these weeks than I learned about some people I knew for years. I've seen how you handle adversity, how you treat others, how you find joy in simple things, even when life has knocked you down. Those are the things that matter, not how long we've known each other." Maria felt her world tilting on its axis. Everything she thought she understood about her situation suddenly called into question. "But what about your solitude, your need to be alone? You said yourself that you came up here to escape from people and their expectations." "I thought that was what I needed," Tyler admitted. "But having you here has shown me the difference between being alone and being lonely. I was lonely, Maria, even if I didn't want to admit it. You've brought life back to this place, brought life back to me in ways I didn't even realize I was missing." The sincerity in Tyler's voice was unmistakable, and Maria found herself torn between hope and fear. The practical part of her mind recognized that staying with Tyler would solve all her immediate problems, would give her security and companionship in a place in the world. But another part of her worried that she was simply trading one form of dependence for another, that she would be defining herself through another man's identity rather than discovering her own. "I care about you too," she said carefully, "more than I expected to, more than I thought I was capable of feeling again so soon. But I need to know that I'm choosing to be here, not just accepting it because it's my best option for survival." Tyler nodded, understanding immediately what she was trying to say. "What would it take for you to know that?" Maria thought about the question, trying to identify what she needed to feel confident in such a momentous decision. "Time, I think, and the knowledge that I could leave if I wanted to, that I'm staying because I choose to, not because I have nowhere else to go." "Then take the time you need," Tyler said without hesitation. Stay through the winter. See how you feel when spring comes. If you want to leave then, I'll help you get wherever you want to go. Help you start whatever kind of life you want to build. But if you decide you want to stay, know that you'll be welcomed not as a refugee or a charity case, but as an equal partner in whatever we build together. The offer was more generous than Maria had dared to hope for, addressing her deepest fears while still leaving room for the possibility of something beautiful and lasting. She looked into Tyler's eyes and saw not just desire or loneliness, but genuine respect and affection, the foundation for something that could grow into love, given time and nurturing. As winter progressed, Maria found herself settling more deeply into the rhythm of life in Tyler's mountain sanctuary. The work was hard but satisfying, from tending the fire that kept them warm to preparing the meals that sustained them through the long, cold days. But more than the practical aspects of their partnership, Maria treasured the quiet moments of connection that grew more frequent and meaningful as they learned to trust each other with their deepest thoughts and feelings. Tyler proved to be a patient teacher, showing Maria how to read the mountain weather, how to identify animal tracks in the snow, how to maintain the various systems that kept their isolated homestead functioning. In return, Maria brought her own skills and perspectives to their shared life, introducing Tyler to recipes and techniques that made their simple meals more interesting and nutritious, organizing their supplies with an efficiency that impressed even his methodical nature. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to simply be together, to find comfort in each other's presence without the need for constant conversation or activity. Maria had never experienced this kind of companionship with Roberto, whose attention had always seemed divided between her and his business concerns. Tyler's focus, when he chose to give it, was complete and unwavering, making Maria feel valued and appreciated in ways she had never known were possible. One evening in late February, as they sat by the fire sharing stories of their childhood memories, Tyler made an observation that surprised Maria with its insight. "You're different than when you first arrived," he said, looking at her with those dark, thoughtful eyes. "Stronger, more confident. You move through the world differently now, like you know your place in it." Maria considered his words, recognizing the truth in them. "I feel different," she admitted. "More like myself, if that makes sense. Not the person Roberto wanted me to be, or the person I thought I had to be to survive, but the person I actually am underneath all of that." "And who is that person?" Tyler asked with genuine curiosity. "Someone who's stronger than she thought, braver than she believed, more capable than she ever had the chance to prove. Someone who can build a life worth living, whether she's alone or with someone who truly sees and values her." Tyler smiled at her answer, an expression of such warmth and pride that it made Maria's heart skip a beat. "I'm glad you found her again. She's someone worth knowing." The compliment, simple as it was, meant more to Maria than any elaborate praise could have. Tyler had watched her at her lowest point, had seen her desperate and broken and afraid, and yet he could still look at her and see someone worth respecting and caring about. That knowledge gave her a foundation of self-worth that no external circumstances could shake. As March arrived with its promise of eventual spring, Maria began to feel a growing certainty about her future. The woman who had stumbled into Tyler's clearing in desperation was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own value and was ready to make choices based on what she wanted rather than what she feared. When Tyler brought up the subject of her plans one evening over dinner, Maria was ready with her answer. "I want to stay," she said simply, "not because I have to, not because it's my only option, but because I choose to, because what we've built together here is worth preserving and growing." Tyler's face lit up with a joy so pure and unguarded that Maria felt her own heart swell in response. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Really sure?" "I'm sure," Maria replied, reaching across the table to take his large, work-roughened hand in her smaller, equally calloused ones. "I love you, Tyler Cox. I love the man you are, the life we've created together, the person I become when I'm with you. If you'll have me, I'd like to make this permanent." Tyler's response was to stand and pull Maria into his arms, holding her close as if he could hardly believe she was real in choosing to stay with him. When he finally spoke, His voice was thick with emotion and wonder. I love you too, Maria Martinez, more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone. You've brought light back into my life, shown me that isolation isn't the same as peace, that sharing your life with the right person makes everything better, not worse. They held each other in the firelight, two people who had found in each other not just companionship but completion, not just survival but the possibility of genuine happiness. The mountain winds howled outside their cabin walls, but inside, warmth and love created a sanctuary that no external storm could touch. When spring finally arrived with its promise of new beginnings, Maria and Tyler began making plans for their future together. They would expand the cabin, create space for the family they both hoped to have someday. Tyler would continue his work helping stranded travelers and maintaining his reputation as the mountain's most reliable guardian, while Maria would establish herself as an equal partner in their shared enterprise. But first, they decided to make a trip down to Copper Ridge, not because Maria needed to return to her old life, but because she wanted to face her past with Tyler at her side, to show the town and herself how completely her circumstances had changed. The journey down the mountain was like traveling backward through time, each familiar landmark reminding Maria of the desperate woman who had climbed the same path months earlier. But the fear and desperation were gone now, replaced by confidence and purpose. She was no longer running from something but moving toward a future of her own choosing. When they reached the outskirts of Copper Ridge, Maria felt Tyler's hand squeeze hers reassuringly. She looked up at him, this man who had seen her at her lowest point and helped her discover her highest potential, and felt a surge of gratitude so intense it was almost overwhelming. Thank you, she said softly, for everything, for seeing who I could be when I couldn't see it myself. Thank you for letting me help, Tyler replied, for trusting me enough to stay, to build something beautiful together. As they walked into town together, Maria held her head high, no longer the desperate woman begging for work, but a partner in a life well lived, a woman who had found not just love, but herself in the process. The rough hands that had once been a source of shame were now a badge of honor, proof of her strength and resilience, evidence of the journey that had brought her to this moment of complete and perfect happiness. The townspeople who saw them together whispered among themselves, marveling at the transformation in Maria Martinez and wondering about the mysterious mountain man who had captured her heart. But Maria paid them no attention, focused instead on the future she and Tyler would build together, a future founded on mutual respect, genuine love, and the unshakable knowledge that some of life's greatest treasures come disguised as its greatest challenges. In the end, Maria's desperate plea for any work for a meal had led her to something far more valuable than mere survival. It had led her to Tyler Cox, to love, and most importantly, to herself. And as they walked hand in hand through the streets of Copper Ridge, both of them knew that their greatest adventures were still ahead of them, waiting to be discovered in the mountains that had brought them together, and the love that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead.